Good morning, everybody, and welcome to episode 27 of MakerBot Chats. My name is Felipe. It's great to have you guys here. It's kind of weird now because of the way that my cameras are set up. Let me just jump to my second one. So I have a few cameras right here. I want to show you guys how did I went about setting my printers here. What are the things that I would consider overall? There we go. And basically talk about what you need to think when setting up your MakerBot printers. In this case, what I have is, let me move my camera just a tad. Here we go. So what I have here are my Method X and my Sketch printers. Both of them, sitting on top of a very standard storage unit. Nothing too fancy about that, but we'll talk about the electrical requirements. We'll talk about why did I choose this setup, what works for me, what doesn't, and just ideas for you guys to do the same thing. Now, the thing with, well, it's not a thing, but like the interesting thing about MakerBot printers is that you can see them in many different places, right? They can be placed at school, they can be placed at a factory floor, or in my case, since I'm still working from home, quite literally placed on top of a desktop, right? That's kind of like the idea behind them, is giving you guys the ability to do something rather flexible and rather intuitive with the printers and be able to deploy them in any given location without much of a hassle. I don't know if you guys have seen one of our latest case studies about the Dakar Rally. And essentially they took a Method X, and I think two of them, and drove them around the Middle East in the middle of the desert and deployed them as they went. That's the idea, right? You don't have to have a massive footprint. You don't have to have a massive piece of real estate to place them. I'll switch back to these other views so that you guys can see kind of the bigger picture of the setup in order to deploy them. And essentially all you need is a firm and flat surface. Depending on the method or the sketch, it's going to vary a little bit. The footprint of both printers is very similar. They are both about 4 square feet. So that's generous. I would say maybe 2.5. We're talking about 18 inches perhaps per side for each printer. I would give it a little bit more. Maybe think about 20 inches per side, just to be sure. And make sure that you have a solid, sturdy surface to place them at. Of course, Sketch is going to be much lighter than Method. Sketch will weigh in at about 15, I think, 20 pounds at most. So it's a very light printer. It doesn't really require much in terms of the sturdiness of the surface. Method, on the other hand, we're talking about well over 30 pounds. It's going to be, on the a little bit heavier, or definitely heavier than Sketch. And because of that, you want to make sure that the surface is able to take on the load, but B, you have a surface that it's not going to be rocking around and wobbling, right? It's really important to consider the fact that the printers are going to be carrying some moving weight. What I mean by that is, if you think about both of them, mostly on the Method though, the way that the gantry moves back and forth, that's a irrelevant weight. It's probably going to be about, let's say, a pound of, material. It's not material, but essentially components moving around. And as it does that, if you have a wobbly surface, the surface itself will just multiply the movement of the printer, and you will end up having this kind of ruckus of a setup where you could compromise the print quality of it, but ultimately it's just going to be super annoying to either hear it moving, hear it wobbling, and it's just not great, right? So big surface, about 20 by 20 inches, just to start. Make sure that it's sturdy. I would say also good idea to have some sort of open space, clean space to just use as a little bit of a post-processing setup. In this case, I've got some of the prints here. I've got, I'll talk about the things that I usually work with, but it's pretty basic, right? I think starting, of course, Sharpie, always useful to carry one of these around, just in case. I've got my calipers here as well. You know, it doesn't take that much space, just to be able to measure things quickly as they come out of the printer if I need them. I also had my pliers. These it's mainly, you know, when I'm switching over filament, just to make sure that I'm starting with clean tip of filament, right, kind of flat. And finally, and this is kind of my personal favorite, quick cut tool, paddle, I don't know even how to call it, spatula, right? This is like, I've tested quite a few of them, you know, throughout the years. This has been, in my experience, the best one in removing items from the build plate. And I've used it for both the Sketch and the Method platforms. It works amazingly. I've used it for PLA, I've used it for nylon carbon fiber, I've used it for our metal printing, and it's just amazing. I mean, it has a really nice sort of almost sharp blade here on the front, and then ends up with a little bit of a thicker end. It's almost 0.5 millimeter at the end, and probably like 200 microns at the front. So it has a really nice sort of tapered edge that just makes it awesome to work with. It's not sharp, but it'll definitely do the job at removing the parts from the build plate, especially for some of them when you're using a raft or when you're using brims just to secure those parts in the build plate. It's just amazing to use it. Now, moving on to the electrical requirements. With Sketch, you can probably just connect it to any outlet. Both of the printers, by the way, will run on a standard 120 volt outlet. However, the watts that they use is going to be considerably different. In the Method's case, the peak load is going to be about 400 watts. In the Method X, it goes all the way to 800 when it's heating up. So you will want to consider that, right? You will want to consider the fact that the printer's electrical requirements are going to be different depending on the one that you get. And that's essentially coming down to how much heat they will produce. With Sketch, you get a standard heated extruder, right? So if you imagine of it, you know, of the electrical current that's running into the printer, it's basically powering the touchscreen and the extruder itself, which is just basically a point, you know, of heat. In Method's case, however, you have a much more complex setup. Now, if you had a regular method, it will heat up to about 60 degrees Celsius maximum. So that's where, you know, those 400 watts come in. It's pretty standard. You can probably connect it to most outlets. I would suggest using a dedicated outlet just to be sure and safe. I've seen, and we've had it in the past in the office, where we burst the outlet because we loaded too many printers into a single one, basically creating or using a power cord and an extension cord. So yeah, I would use a dedicated outlet for Method. For Method X, for sure you need a dedicated outlet. So connect it to something that's not sharing, you know, the current with, say, an AC unit or a microwave or anything else that's on the shop. You gotta be sure that it's just using a dedicated one for Method X, because that extended heating range, right, going all the way to 110 degrees Celsius for the heat chamber, it's going to draw considerably much more power, so almost 800 watts, because we're not longer only powering the touchscreen, we're also powering the extruders themselves, which will heat up, like on average I would say like to 270 degrees Celsius, and more important than that, the chamber itself. So the chamber is going to be heating up to about 100 degrees Celsius on average, 110 for certain materials. So it is going to definitely draw a lot of current, and that's something to consider as well. Finally, I'll just tilt the camera view a little bit here, lower. So finally, it's a good idea to have just a storage area close by, whether you'll be storing some of the prints that you make or some of the tools. It's just really useful because, well, it keeps everything tidy. In my case, what I got right here are my extruders. We've talked about how we refer to extruders as essentially drill bits for the printer, but I have quite a wide range of them. That's because I use dedicated extruders for different materials. I'll have my metal extruder, I'll have my composites extruder, I have my Model 1 extruder, which is like kind of our standard polymers extruder. This includes PLA, nylon, PETG, and so on and so forth. So you will want to have a space for those. I think that especially for Method X users, as soon as you start expanding your range of materials, you will want to have dedicated tool heads and extruders for the printer, just because essentially, each material type will heat up to different temperatures, and in doing so, you can leave behind, and you will leave behind, a little bit of debris of the material. So let's say if you're printing with ABS and later at say 250 degrees Celsius, and later on you're printing with a less heat intensive material like PETG, right? That temperature difference in the material means that whatever debris is left after the ABS printing process is complete will not be melted out by the next material over, unless the printing temperature is higher in the new material. So it's important to keep that in mind and to make sure that the extruders are sort of as clean as they can be. And the easiest way to ensure that is just to have dedicated tool heads. It's just going to give you, much more peace of mind. You can of course have, a labs extruder and run through it every single material. That's of course an option, and that's an alternative. I personally think that's not great, because you will have to constantly not constantly, but often purge the extruder, make sure that there's no debris left in it, especially if you're toggling between, let's say, composites, polymers, and now metals. So imagine you print nylon carbon fiber one day, and the next day over you want to print the 316L metal material, and the next day over you want to print ABS. It's 100% possible, right? You can use the same extruder to print all of the materials. However, you will likely compromise the flow of the material just by switching back and forth. You will want to first make sure that the extruder is clean by resetting it, by purging it. And it just adds an extra step to the process. So I would say stick to individual extruders, at least for every single material family. And what I mean by that is like standard polymers, think about PLA, PETG, even nylon, single extruder, usually extruder number one. High temp polymers, say ABS, ASA, and the like, would be extruder 1XA. And then you can have one for composites, so for nylon carbon fiber, ABS carbon fiber, ABS Kevlar, and so on, which could be the 1C extruder or just a labs extruder. The Gen 2 will take that, no problem. And if you're printing with metals as well, I would recommend having, especially for that one, having a dedicated extruder for the 316L metal material, just because that one it's a little bit more challenging to print. But yeah, so extruders, something else to keep in mind as you kind of create your setup. Doesn't take a lot of space, but a good idea to have them around, like lying up orderly. And finally, of course, we have, let me move a little bit to be able to open it, but we have just place to store material, right? Our material comes in these Mylar bags. It's really, really useful because it keeps the material dry and in pristine shape, just so that waiting for you to use it. Once the Mylar bag is open, you can see here, it comes with a resealable edge. It's essentially like a Ziploc bag. So you'll be able to take it out and back inside of the bag. That's really important because you want to keep your material as dry as possible. But yeah, keep the material in the bag. Don't open it if you're not planning on using it just yet. If you're using it, I would suggest, keeping it inside of the material bay of the material drawer. That keeps the material dry and happy for a longer amount of time. And if you're switching over the material, maybe just put it back in the Mylar bag, store it, and wait for the next time that you'll use it. Now, some materials, like in this case, I have an extra spool of PLA for my sketch printer. Some materials will be definitely less sensitive to moisture than others. PLA, not too bad to keep outside of a bag. I would still recommend keeping it in a bag. Of course, this is me not following my own advice, but it's not as critical as other materials such as nylon carbon fiber. You definitely want to keep it inside of a bag, or inside of the dry sealed material base. All of the soluble materials, 100% you need to keep them inside of the base or in a bag, just because The whole idea behind those materials is for them to soak up humidity in order to be able to dissolve once you're done printing. So yeah, bag, keep it, it's important. And that's about it, right? So overall, my setup here is about, let's say, 4 feet by 2 feet, and that fits nicely my, well, is it 4 feet? So 1, 2, yeah, about 4 feet. It fits nicely my both printers. I have, you know, the luxury of having both of them in the same location. Sketch, Method X, storage unit, small area for to do some post-processing work, and that's about it. Other than that, just keep in mind your outlet requirements. Make sure that you have dedicated outlets, especially for the Method X. In this case, I am using the same outlet for the Method X and the Sketch. The Sketch really doesn't draw that much current anyways, so it's not too bad. But yeah, I have personally blown out fuses back at the office where we had, I think the limit was something about 3 Method X's in a single outlet. Well, not a single outlet, but you know, you get what I mean. A single extension cord, and the fuse just blew up. So it was fun, but just happened once, and yeah, wouldn't recommend it. So keeping one outlet for the Method X, you can probably have more than, you know, 4 sketches in a single fuse of the sketches. But definitely something to consider, right? Just be careful with that. Nothing really bad is going to happen outside of blowing up the fuse, but it's better to have a dedicated one just to have that extra peace of mind that you're not compromising the electrical system of your building. And with that, I want to keep it short this morning and jump right into the questions. So Alejandra, as always, has our questions, is capturing questions on the back end. So just feel free to post anything that you were wondering in that chat section on the right hand of your screen. If you're looking at the recorded version of this, then make sure to comment out down there, and we'll be answering those you know, later. So let's start here. Can you use replicator PLA spools on the method? Yes, you can. However, you will need to be using the labs extruder. Why? Because if you're using the dedicated PLA extruder on the method, then it's going to ask the drawer if you have actually loaded method PLA. So you just need the labs extruder, but yeah, you can use old replicator spools on the method. Now, one thing to consider though, going back to that comment on the humidity levels on the material and whatnot, material that's been sitting around for too long, especially if it's been opened, might have soaked a little bit of humidity from the environment, so just keep that in mind. But yeah, 100% you can use PLA spools on the method. I'm assuming that you're like switching over from a Rep Plus to a method, and you have some leftover materials. Shouldn't be a problem. How safe are printers to leave overnight? Is it okay to do in school environments? 100%. And I print overnight all the time, especially because some of these parts take a little bit more than 12 hours to print. So there's really no problem. You can leave them running. We have the Cloud Print software, which automatically connects to the printer and allows you to remotely track and monitor the progress of your prints. So yeah, no problem in doing that. I do it all the time, and it's super stable, super safe. So going back to the electrical requirements, nothing's going to happen. Just make sure that there's a dedicated outlet. Oh, and make sure, because in some office spaces and in some schools, you know, we do know that sometimes they'll just cut the power overnight. So if that happens, of course, your print will stop running. But if you have power running through the night, there's no issue in keeping the printers running overnight. For classroom environment, what is the recommendation for power outlets? Do they need to be under on circuit? What might be the amp draw? We have classrooms that have limited plugs and circuit options. So I would say go to the specification page of the printers. Overall, 1 printer per outlet, you're going to be more than fine. If you're looking at sketches will not draw more than a laptop. So, you know, if you have a computer connected to that outlet, it's going to do fine with the sketch. If you're looking at a method, it's not going to be that much higher, but it's not the amps, but the watts, right? So it's going to be 400 watts for the method and about 800 for Method X. Both of them running at 120 volts. And I would just say have a dedicated outlet and preferably fuse for each printer. But go to the, if you want the more detailed information, you just go to the specifications page. If you go to the either method page or the sketch page, all the way to the bottom, you will see the tech specs, and that's where you will get all of these current draw specs. How do you balance getting enough airflow and filtration in the enclosure without impacting the quality of print due to cooling of the material bed too much? Okay, so essentially we have two systems here, right? With Sketch, the enclosure is completely sealed, so there's really no active air being drawn into the printer, and it's just keeping a little bit of that heating element inside by being enclosed. It's not hermetically enclosed, but it definitely has the shields. In Method's case, we are actively controlling the temperature, the air, and everything that there is within that system. That is done automatically by two fans that are present on the back side of the printer. And there's nothing for you to do other than making sure that there's nothing on the lid. So the lid of the Method, it's perforated, you can see here. Just don't cover it up, and the printer will take care of both the temperature settings and the airflow for you. So yeah, it's actually smart in that way. It's going to be controlling the input of air, say cool air, with the output of hot air that's being heated up in the printer itself. But it's done automatically. As long as you keep the printer, you don't put anything on top of the printer, you'll be fine. The printer will do it on its own. My right cleaning block keeps breaking off the build plate. Any recommendations? My right cleaning block. I am not sure what do you mean by right cleaning block. Keeps breaking off the build plate. I am not sure what do you mean by that. Recommendations on cleaning the build plate, I would say use a spatula. That's what I use. That's it. I don't clean it off with water or any chemical product. Yeah, the spatula, this one from Cricut, is great. And that's about it. I've never really washed them or anything, and that's another thing. Like with both these printers, you don't really need to have any additional adhesive. We do know that some printers ask you to use like something like Dyma Fix or glue stick or something and the like to keep the parts attached to the build plate. That's not the case with these printers. I wouldn't use anything out of the other, anything external to keep the material in place. It's just going to be, done and covered by the printer itself. That's the beauty of the automated system, and also the actual composite that makes up for the build tape in the build plate itself. Where do the printing gases go? What happens to the gases at the end of the print job when one opens the door? So it's not, as I said, it's not hermetically closed. So the printer is going to be, to some extent, allowing air to flow through the printer. But we have done extensive testing, and we will be releasing a proper documentation on that soon, especially for the Green Guard certification, which essentially, how do you say, certifies that the printers don't expel any more volatile compounds than, say, a regular inkjet printer. So you won't be getting any toxic fumes or anything of the like from any of these printers while using, say, PLA, TOF, all of the standard classroom materials. And we are also about to release a clean air filter for the Method that will even more so sort of do a second cleanup of the air after it's been printed out. So there's really no danger there. I wouldn't keep it on a closet. I've seen some people do that, like keeping the printers inside of the closet. That's not great for a few reasons, but I would say, as long as you keep it in a fairly open space, it doesn't have to be industrially ventilated, but just ventilated enough, you'll be fine. They don't emit anything, much more than your average inkjet printer. So yeah, wouldn't. Cleaning block, the block where the extruders purge. Oh, okay. The block where the extruders purge when they change from support to the ASA on other material. Okay, so I'll go back to your question. Breaking off the build plate. On that, I'm not sure. I would suggest running up the calibration again. So the question is like the cleaning block, meaning the purge tower, where the extruders do a little square in order to purge back and forth between support and model material. If you're using PVA material, make sure that it's really, really dry. I haven't seen any issues with SR30, but I would say trying those two things. And I can give you a third one, but first, make sure that the extruders are calibrated properly. Second, just check that there's no leftover material on the build plate. And third, you can also replace the build plate on the build, the build tape on the build plate. That's fairly straightforward. The tape itself, I think it's like $20 for 3 sheets of them, so it's easy to replace. Those would be like kind of like the quick recommendations on that. Does a Replicator Plus have the same features as Method X or Sketch? Replicator Plus is closer in nature to Sketch, but I would honestly recommend you better having used and had both Sketch and Rep Plus. I like the Sketch much better. It's a more stable platform. Rep Plus and Sketch, both of them are single extrusion printers. That means you will only print with one material. With Method, you have 2 extruders. That means we have the material that you will use for your part and the soluble supports that essentially create a scaffolding for the part that can be later on dissolved. With Sketch and with the Rep Plus, it's just one material, both for the part and for the supports. So you have to mechanically like grab a plier and remove the supports at a later point in time. Rep Plus, it's now probably like 5 years old. It has a slightly larger build plate than the Sketch, but I don't think it makes up for the sturdiness of the platform. I would definitely go for the Sketch. I think it's even cheaper than a Rep Plus, and if you're looking for something more advanced, something that allows you to print with more complex materials, definitely check out on the Method. Rep Plus, it's a great printer. It's a little bit dated now, so if you're still looking for single material, Sketch. Something more advanced, Method. Even the starting price of the regular Method is fairly close to that of the Rep Plus. Have you worked out the optimum airflow rate for an air-filtered enclosure that allows for a lower ambient temperature for printing materials such as PLA without losing out on the filtration benefits? I think this relates to the product that we are about to release in the coming months. So yes, we are releasing an additional element that will clean the air even further for you. We have some more updates coming up, so keep an eye out for that. But overall, the printers are fairly stable. There's no real considerations on the operating temperatures, as long as it's indoors, right? If you're not printing at, say, 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius, you should be fine. And regarding airflow, just keep it in a well-ventilated room. That's about it. But that's more, yeah, don't put it in a closet. That's what I'm saying. And with that, I think, one more question. Can you pause the Method overnight and restart it later in the morning or next day? No, you cannot. Sorry, you can, but you cannot cut the power off, if that's what you're asking. I personally would not recommend it. I think that it's the whole point of the printer is for it to work while you're doing something else. So I would better leave it running overnight, especially because if you pause it and then start it off again the next day, the printer will still be drawing power and the chamber will still be heated up. So you will be consuming a considerable amount of power without doing much. I would just let it run. You can definitely pause it overnight. Don't cut the power, you can just pause it. The chamber itself will stay at the same temperature, and that's why it's going to be drawing still a considerable amount of power. And I would just recommend letting it run through the night. But yeah, with that, I think we have covered most of the questions. So again, thank you guys so much for watching. We'll be seeing you next time, next week with a new episode of Chats. As always, our social media accounts at MakerBot, both in Instagram and Twitter. And yeah, I'll see you next week, and happy printing. Have a good one. Bye.